My husband has claimed to be a struggling artist while I worked 2 jobs. I just found bank statements showing he inherited millions before we met. Our life, for all 8 years of our marriage, has been a masterpiece of scarcity. Our apartment is a testament to the beauty of making do, the threadbare but beloved armchair, the mismatched plates we bought at a thrift store, the persistent water stain on the ceiling that Julian, my husband, once lovingly referred to as our living fresco. I have always seen the scarcity not as poverty but as a noble sacrifice. We were patrons of a singular, brilliant talent, Julian's art. I am a waitress by day, a cleaner by night. My life is a blur of tired feet, the smell of bleach, and the forced polite smiles that pay our rent. I work holidays, birthdays, and anniversaries. I haven't bought a new dress in 3 years, and my idea of a vacation is getting to sleep in until 8 a.m. I have never once complained, because Julian is an artist. A brilliant, misunderstood, and, until now, commercially unsuccessful one. His work is his entire world. Our small second bedroom is his studio, a sacred, paint-splattered space I rarely enter. He works in there for hours wrestling with his canvas, emerging with paint in his hair and a look of profound, tortured exhaustion on his face. He creates large abstract paintings that are, even to my untrained eye, breathtaking. They are full of a raw, visceral pain and a deep, weary beauty. His series, which the few critics who've seen it have called a brutal masterpiece of urban melancholy, is titled The Weight of It All. I have always believed my role in this life was simple, to be the strong, practical foundation upon which his fragile genius could be built. I handled the bills, the groceries, the harsh realities of the world so that he could be free to create. My struggle, my exhaustion, my sacrifice, it was all fuel for the fire of his art. Our struggle, I told myself, was our struggle. I was a part of his creation, the silent co-author of his eventual success. This morning, that beautiful, noble lie was shattered. A pipe burst in the wall of the apartment above ours, and water began streaming into Julian's studio. It was a catastrophe. I rushed in, moving canvases and covering supplies, my heart pounding with fear for his work. As I was moving a stack of old paint-stiffened drop cloths, the cardboard box they were on, softened by the water, gave way. Its contents spilled across the floor. It was a box of mail, old, unopened envelopes, mostly junk. But underneath them were several large, stiff envelopes from a private investment bank. They were damp, but not destroyed. One of them had torn open. Inside was a quarterly statement printed on heavy, expensive paper. My first thought was that it was a mistake. Junk mail delivered to the wrong address. But the name on the statement was clear. Julian Croft. My husband. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The numbers on the page seemed to swim before my eyes. They were abstract, nonsensical. I read the total assets line at the bottom of the page. Then I read it again. And again. I had to sit down on the damp, paint-stained floor, the sound of the dripping water fading into a dull roar in my ears. The statement showed a professionally managed portfolio of stocks, bonds, and real estate holdings. The current value was a little over $7.5 million. A small note on the side indicated that the account had been opened 12 years ago, 4 years before I met him, with a principal deposit of $5 million and inheritance. For a full minute, I didn't breathe. I thought of my 2 jobs. I thought of the aching in my back as I scrubbed floors last night. I thought of the secondhand winter coat I'd bought, the one with the torn lining. I thought of every single sacrifice, every single moment of worry over a late bill or an empty pantry. Our entire life, our noble struggle, was a lie. We weren't struggling. I was struggling. He was a millionaire playing the part of a starving artist.
I stood up, the statement clutched in my hand, and I walked out of the studio and into the living room where he was reading, oblivious. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I was too far gone for that. I simply held out the paper. "What is this?" I asked, my voice a dead, hollow thing. He looked up from his book, saw the statement in my hand, and the color drained from his face. For a moment, I saw a flicker of genuine panic, the look of a man whose deepest secret has been unearthed. But then it was gone, replaced by an expression of calm, almost philosophical seriousness. He took off his reading glasses and looked at me, not with the eyes of a husband, but with the cool, appraising gaze of an artist looking at his subject. "I can explain," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. He stood up and took the statement from my hand, glancing at it as if it were a minor inconvenience. "Please do," I whispered. He looked at me, his expression earnest, as if he were about to reveal a profound universal truth. "An artist needs to capture the truth of the human condition," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a lecture. "And the most authentic truth, the most powerful emotion, is suffering, struggle, the daily grinding weight of it all. I couldn't create that from a place of comfort and ease. I needed to be immersed in it. I needed to live it, to breathe it." He paused, taking a step closer to me, his eyes shining with a terrifying sincerity. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, my love," he said, his voice soft and intimate. "Suffering is essential for art, and your struggle, your beautiful, noble, heartbreaking struggle, has been my greatest muse." His words hung in the air between us, a grotesque and twisted confession. He wasn't apologizing. He was taking credit. He was presenting his deception not as a betrayal, but as a necessary, almost noble, artistic process. My life, my exhaustion, my aching back and worn-out shoes, they weren't shared burdens of a partnership. They were his raw materials. I wasn't his wife, I was his muse. And a muse, in his world, didn't need comfort or security. A muse needed to be authentic. A muse needed to suffer beautifully. I felt a strange, chilling detachment, as if I were floating above the scene watching a play. The man standing before me, the man I had loved and sacrificed for, was a complete stranger. The Julian I knew, the sensitive, struggling artist who was pained by the world's injustices, was a character, a meticulously crafted role he had been playing for 8 years. And I was his unwitting co-star, the only person who didn't know the performance was fake. "My struggle?" I repeated. The words tasted like poison in my mouth. "You mean the extra shifts I took when you needed that expensive German canvas? The dental work I put off for a year because we couldn't afford it? The nights I came home with my feet bleeding, too tired to even speak? That was your muse?" "Yes," he said, his eyes alight with a terrifying, passionate sincerity. "Don't you see the beauty in it, Sarah? Your sacrifice, your resilience? It's all in the work. It's in every brushstroke of the weight of it all. That series isn't just mine, it's ours. It's a testament to the raw, unfiltered truth of a life lived on the edge." He genuinely believed it. That was the most horrifying part. He had so thoroughly blurred the lines between his art and my life that he could no longer see the moral chasm he was standing in. He saw my pain as a vibrant color on his palette. He had observed my hardship, studied it, and replicated it on canvas for his own gain, all while holding the key to its immediate annihilation. My mind, numb with shock, began to race, recontextualizing the last 8 years. Every memory was now tainted, viewed through this new, horrifying lens. The time our heat was shut off for a weekend in the dead of winter, I had cried from the cold and the shame while he had held me, telling me that this experience would make us stronger. Now I saw it for what it was, a research trip. He wasn't my partner in misery. He was a sociologist in a self-created poverty experiment. The small, romantic gestures now seemed monstrous. The time he'd sketched me asleep on the couch after a 16-hour double shift, my face etched with exhaustion. He had called the piece Weary Grace and told me he had never seen anything so beautiful. It wasn't a tribute to my strength. It was an artist capturing his subject at its most authentic, its most useful. "So the money," I started, my voice a hoarse whisper. "It's just been sitting there? All this time?" "Of course," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "To touch it would be to break the spell. It would invalidate the entire project. The art has to be real, Sarah. The suffering has to be real." "But it wasn't real for you!" I finally screamed, the detachment shattering, a wave of pure, molten rage breaking through the dam of my shock. "You had a safety net worth $7.5 million. I was the only one on the high wire, and you were the one holding the net, telling me to look down. It was an immersive experience, he insisted, his voice calm, trying to soothe the hysterical subject. I lived here. I ate the same food. I breathed the same air. I denied myself the comforts the money could provide. You denied yourself comforts, I repeated, my voice dripping with venom I didn't know I possessed. But you never had to deny yourself security. You never had to lie awake at night wondering how you were going to make rent. You never had to choose between a subway pass and a meal. You were a tourist in my life, Julian, a poverty tourist, taking pictures of the scenery while I was the one living and dying in it. The accusation finally landed. A flicker of something. Was it shame crossing his features? But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced with a defensive arrogance. You don't understand art, he said, his voice cold. You see the world in black and white, in dollars and cents. I see it in texture, in color, in emotion. What we created here is more important than a few years of hardship. It's eternal. It's a masterpiece. He gestured around our shabby apartment, at the threadbare armchair and the peeling paint, as if he were a king surveying his realm. This, he said, with a sweep of his hand, this was our cathedral of suffering. And the art that was born here, it will be worth it. You'll see. I looked at him. At this man who had used my life as a canvas, who had glorified my pain and called it art. I had spent 8 years believing I was supporting a dream. But I wasn't. I was the dream. And I had just woken up into the nightmare. The water was still dripping in the studio, a slow, steady rhythm, like a clock ticking on a life that had just been declared a fraud. His declaration, "It will be worth it, you'll see," hung in the air, a prophecy of a future I was no longer a part of. He was talking about art gallery openings, critical acclaim, the moment when his masterpiece would finally be unveiled and the world would understand the necessity of his methods. He was talking about a future where my years of hardship would be validated, framed, and sold to the highest bidder. He was offering me a supporting role in his victory parade, expecting me to be grateful for the ride. But the woman he was talking to no longer existed. The supportive, self-sacrificing partner had died on the studio floor sometime between the discovery of the bank statement and his chilling confession. The person standing in her place was a stranger, even to myself. A woman hollowed out by betrayal. And in that hollow space, a cold, hard anger was beginning to form, like a diamond under immense pressure. I didn't scream at him again. I didn't cry. I simply turned away from him and walked back into the flooded studio. The water was still dripping, a steady, rhythmic torture. I looked at his life's work, the canvases of his The Weight of It All series that were leaning against the walls. They were beautiful. They were powerful. And they were stolen. He had stolen my life, my emotions, my exhaustion, and smeared them onto a canvas, calling the theft creation. "What are you doing?" he asked, following me into the room. His voice was cautious, like a zookeeper approaching a newly enraged animal. I didn't answer. I walked over to the largest canvas, the centerpiece of his collection. It was a swirling vortex of dark blues and grays with a single faint speck of yellow in the center. He had once told me it represented a single spark of hope in the universe of oppressive despair. I now knew it represented the single flickering flame of my own spirit that he had been so carefully observing. "This one," I said, my voice eerily calm as I ran a finger along the rough, textured surface of the painting. "This is the one you painted the winter our heat was shut off, isn't it?" "Yes," he said, a note of pride in his voice, mistaking my question for a sign of understanding. "I was trying to capture the feeling of that cold, the way it seeped into our bones. The color palette is directly inspired by the frost on the window panes." "I see," I said. I walked to another canvas, a chaotic explosion of angry reds and blacks. And this one.
This must be from the month I was working double shifts at the restaurant and trying to fight off that eviction notice. The raw, desperate energy? Yes, he said, his arrogance returning. The fury of the working class, trapped in a system designed to break them. It's one of my most political pieces. I looked at him then, at this man who had the audacity to speak of the fury of the working class while sitting on a mountain of inherited wealth. He was a parasite, feeding on the authentic struggles of others because he had none of his own. He wasn't an artist. He was a vampire, and he had been draining the life from me for 8 years. My decision, when it came, was not a thought. It was a pure physical instinct, a reflex. I turned to the table where his supplies were laid out. My eyes landed on a large open can of turpentine. Next to it was a jar of gesso, a thick, opaque, white primer. Before he could react, I picked up the can of turpentine. "What is art without suffering, Julian?" I asked, my voice a dead, flat monotone. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he said, a note of real panic in his voice now. The artist was seeing his creation threatened for the first time. "I'm contributing," I said. I unscrewed the lid of the can, and with a single fluid motion, I threw the contents across the face of his masterpiece. The turpentine hit the canvas with a wet slap. The dark blues and grays immediately began to dissolve, the carefully layered oils bleeding and running down the canvas in ugly, distorted streaks. The spark of hope was washed away in a river of chemical solvent. Julian let out a strangled cry, a sound of pure, agonized loss. "No, Sarah, stop! That's my life's work!" "No," I said, turning to him, my eyes as cold and hard as the diamond of my anger. "It's my life's work. You just painted it, and I'm taking it back." I picked up the jar of gesso. I walked to the next canvas, the one inspired by my fury. I dipped my hand directly into the thick white paint, my fingers sinking into the cool, viscous liquid. It felt like a baptism. I looked at the chaotic reds and blacks, my supposed rage captured and framed. Then I placed my hand, dripping with white gesso, squarely in the center of the canvas and began to smear. I was erasing my pain. I was whitewashing his lies. He lunged for me then, but it was too late. The artist had lost control of his muse. And his muse was finally, after 8 long years, creating a masterpiece of her own. It was a masterpiece of destruction. Julian's lunge was clumsy, a desperate, graceless attempt to save his work. He grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging into my skin, but his artist's hands, so adept at creation, were useless at control. I was fueled by a righteous, purifying rage that made me stronger than him. I easily shook him off, a smear of white gesso marking his arm like a brand. He stumbled back, his face a mask of horrified disbelief. He looked from his ruined paintings to me, as if he couldn't comprehend that his gentle, long-suffering subject had suddenly developed the will to destroy. "Sarah, please," he begged, his voice cracking. The arrogant lecturer was gone, replaced by a pleading, pathetic child. "Stop. We can talk about this. The money. You can have it. You can have all of it. Just don't do this." His offer was the ultimate insult. He thought he could buy my forgiveness. He thought the money he had so cruelly withheld for 8 years could now be used as a bargaining chip, a way to save the art that my suffering had produced. He still didn't understand. This was never about the money. It was about the lie. It was about the theft of my life. "It's too late for that, Julian," I said, my voice low and steady. I dipped my hand back into the gesso, the thick white paint feeling like armor. "This is a new installation. It's a performance piece. We can call it the Muse's Rebuke." I moved down the line of canvases, a one-woman demolition crew. With each smear of white, I felt a layer of my old life, of my carefully constructed identity as the supportive wife, sloughing off. I was no longer the patron of his art. I was its censor. I was no longer the subject. I was the critic. And my review was brutal. The canvas he had painted during a summer when I'd had walking pneumonia but couldn't afford to take a day off work. A hazy, feverish landscape of pale yellows and sickly greens was a testament to his keen observational skills. I covered it in a thick, merciless sheet of white. The small, intimate portrait of my hands, the knuckles swollen and the nails broken from my cleaning job, which he had called the hands that build, was an ode to his hypocrisy. I wiped it from existence with a single sweeping gesture. He just stood there, in the center of the flooded studio, and watched. He made no further move to stop me. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant despair. He was a king watching his kingdom burn, a god watching his creation turn to dust. He was witnessing the destruction of his legacy, the erasure of his masterpiece. But what he was really witnessing was the destruction of his muse. The beautiful, suffering woman he had so carefully curated was being painted over, and he was powerless to stop it. When I was finished, the studio was a gallery of ghosts. A collection of white, violated canvases stood around the room, the faint, distorted colors of my pain bleeding through the gesso like old, stubborn bruises. The air was thick with the chemical stench of turpentine and the funereal silence of destruction. I looked at my hands. They were covered in thick, white paint, the gesso already beginning to dry and crack, a perfect metaphor for how I felt. Coated in a hard, protective shell over a self that was still raw and wounded. I walked out of the studio, leaving Julian standing alone amidst the ruins of his life's work. I went into our bedroom, my bedroom, I corrected myself, and I found a single small suitcase. I didn't pack much. The clothes of the woman I had been, the sensible worn-out shoes and the threadbare sweaters, didn't feel like they belonged to me anymore. I packed a few essentials, a change of clothes, and nothing else. I left behind the 8 years of photos, the gifts he had given me, the entire curated collection of our shared life. They were all props from a play I was no longer in. And when I walked back into the living room, he was sitting on the floor, leaning against the threadbare armchair, the one I had loved because it represented our noble struggle. He looked broken, a man who had lost everything. But I felt no pity. He hadn't lost anything that was ever rightfully his. He looked up at me, his eyes empty. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice a hollow whisper. "I don't know," I said, and for the first time in a long time, the not knowing felt like freedom. But it will be a life of my own making, not yours. I walked to the front door, my suitcase feeling light in my hand. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, and I looked back at him one last time. "You were wrong, Julian," I said, my voice clear and strong. "Suffering isn't essential for art. Honesty is. And you are the most dishonest man I have ever known." I walked out the door and didn't look back. I left behind the apartment, the ruined paintings, and the man who had loved my struggle more than he had ever loved me. I had nothing but a small suitcase and a pair of hands coated in drying white paint. But for the first time in 8 years, I wasn't a muse. I was a blank canvas, and I was finally free to paint a life of my own. The first few weeks of my new life were a study in disorientation. I had walked out of our apartment with the righteous fire of my fury to keep me warm, but the reality of my situation was cold and stark. I had no money, no home, and an identity that was so deeply entwined with Julian's that I felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine. I stayed on the couch of a sympathetic coworker from the restaurant, a woman who asked few questions and offered endless cups of tea. I continued to work my 2 jobs, but the meaning had been stripped from them. Before, my exhaustion had been a noble sacrifice, a contribution to a greater artistic cause. Now it was just exhaustion. The ache in my feet was just an ache. The smell of bleach was just the smell of bleach. My life, stripped of the grand narrative Julian had imposed upon it, felt crushingly, terrifyingly ordinary. The silence he had so feared was now my constant companion. In the quiet moments on the late-night bus home or in the pre-dawn stillness of my friend's living room, my mind would churn. I replayed our 8 years together, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached, horrified fascination. I was an archaeologist sifting through the ruins of a collapsed civilization, trying to understand how I could have been so blind. The signs had all been there, hiding in plain sight. His almost clinical interest in my moments of despair. His notebooks, which I had thought were filled with artistic ideas, but which I now realized were filled with observations of me. Notes on the way my shoulders slumped after a long shift, the specific shade of purple under my eyes when I was sick. I hadn't been his partner. I had been his specimen. He tried to contact me, of course. A barrage of texts and voicemails in the first few days, alternating between desperate apologies and arrogant, condescending lectures about the nature of art and sacrifice. He accused me of being a vandal, a destroyer of something beautiful, a woman incapable of understanding true genius. I deleted them all without listening, each message a confirmation of the monster I had escaped. Then came the letters from his lawyer. Official, intimidating documents that spoke of marital assets and intellectual property. He was trying to claim that the ruined paintings were a joint asset and that my act of destruction had cost him millions in potential future earnings. The audacity of it! He was trying to make me pay, literally, for the art that my own suffering had created. That was the moment the sadness and the disorientation finally gave way to a new, steely resolve. He thought I was just a muse, a passive object of inspiration. He was about to find out that the muse had a voice and a story of her own to tell. I used the little money I had to consult with a legal aid lawyer, a sharp, tired-looking woman named Maria, who listened to my story with an expression that shifted from disbelief to a slow, burning rage that matched my own. "So let me get this straight," she said, leaning forward on her desk. "He is a multimillionaire who pretended to be poor for 8 years, used your documented hardship as the direct, stated inspiration for his work, and is now trying to sue you for destroying the evidence of his fraud?" "Essentially, yes," I said. A slow smile spread across Maria's face. "Oh, this is good," she said, a glint in her eye. "This is very, very good." She explained that his legal claim was absurd. But more than that, she explained that he had left himself wide open. He hadn't just been a cruel husband, he had been a fraudulent artist. His entire body of work, his entire artistic identity was built on a lie of authenticity. And in the art world, authenticity is everything. "We're not going to defend," Maria said, her smile widening. "We're going to attack. You're not the destroyer of his art, Sarah. You're its final, most essential ingredient. You were the co-creator, and you're about to claim your copyright." The plan she laid out was audacious, terrifying, and brilliant. It was a legal and artistic gambit that would force Julian out of the shadows and into the harsh, unforgiving light of the truth. He had spent 8 years writing a story about me. It was time for me to publish an epilogue. I would no longer be the silent, suffering muse. I was about to become the narrator, and I was going to tell the world the real story behind the weight of it all. Our first move was a carefully crafted legal theater. On Maria's advice, we didn't just respond to Julian's lawsuit, we countersued. The legal language was dense, but the core of our claim was a beautiful, radical argument that Julian's entire series, the weight of it all, was not his sole creation. We argued that my life, my labor, and my documented suffering were so integral to the work that I was, in fact, an uncredited co-artist. He had provided the canvas and the paint, but I had provided the soul. The lawsuit demanded not only a formal artistic credit on all past and future works in the series, but also 50% of all profits derived from them. It was a declaration of war. We sent a copy of the countersuit not just to his lawyers, but to the handful of influential art critics and gallery owners who had championed his early work. We attached a short, carefully worded press release that didn't reveal the whole story, but hinted at a profoundly unorthodox collaboration and a dispute over the nature of artistic authenticity. We had lit a match and tossed it into the small, insular, gossip-fueled world of contemporary art. The effect was immediate. Julian's legal threats abruptly stopped. His lawyers, who had been sending aggressive, bullying letters, went silent. They knew, as we did, that a public court case would be a disaster for him. The discovery process alone, which would give us access to his financial records and private journals, would unearth the lie he had so carefully guarded. But the most significant response came from a woman named Eleanor Vance. She was the owner of the Vance Gallery, one of the most prestigious and forward-thinking galleries in the city. She was the kingmaker, the woman who could turn an unknown artist into a global sensation. She had been Julian's biggest champion, having seen his work at a small, private showing years ago, and was quietly planning his debut solo exhibition. She sent an email directly to Maria. She wanted a meeting. With me. Alone. The Vance Gallery was a world away from my life of thrift stores and bleach.
It was a cavernous, white-walled space where silence was a form of reverence. The air smelled of money and intellectual rigor. Eleanor Vance was a striking woman in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. She didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She got straight to the point. "I've read your lawsuit," she said, her voice a cool, precise instrument. "It is either the most insane thing I've ever seen or the most brilliant. Tell me your story." And so I did. Sitting in her minimalist, glass-walled office, I told her everything. I told her about my 2 jobs, the shut-off notices, the second-hand coats. I told her about the bank statement, his chilling confession, and my final destructive act in his studio. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I recounted the facts of my life as if I were a historian, detailing the rise and fall of a forgotten empire. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I was finished, she was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on a large, challenging painting on her office wall. "I have a proposition for you," she finally said, turning her sharp eyes back to me. "I am canceling Julian Croft's solo exhibition, which was scheduled for this fall. The centerpiece of that show was to be his entire Weight of It All series." My heart leaped, a small victory. "However," she continued, "the space is still booked, and I find myself in need of a new, compelling exhibition. The art world is bored, Miss Hayes. It is drowning in a sea of predictable, sterile work. It is desperate for something real, something with a story." She leaned forward, a flicker of something predatory and brilliant in her eyes. "Julian's story, his lie, is a good one. But your story, the story of the muse who destroyed the art to reclaim her own life, is a better one. It's the real story." "What are you proposing?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "I am proposing an exhibition," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Your exhibition. We will call it The Muse's Rebuke. We will hang the ruined canvases, the whitewashed paintings exactly as you left them. We will display pages from his journals, if you can get them. We will project your testimony onto the walls. We will not just show the art, we will show the lie behind it. We will turn his cathedral of suffering into a public trial. Your suffering, your story, your final destructive creative act will be the art. And you, Sarah Hayes, will no longer be the muse. You will be the artist." Eleanor's proposition was a lifeline thrown into the chaotic, churning waters of my life. The idea was terrifying. It meant stepping out from behind the curtain of my private humiliation and onto a very public stage. It meant taking the most painful, intimate details of my life and turning them into an exhibit for strangers to gaze at, to judge.
But it was also an act of profound, radical reclamation. For 8 years, Julian had been the sole narrator of my life. This was my chance to seize the narrative, to tell the story in my own voice. I said yes. The next few months were a blur of intense, purposeful activity. My life, which had been a monotonous cycle of grueling work and quiet despair, was suddenly filled with a new, electrifying purpose. I worked closely with Eleanor and her team, a small group of sharp, dedicated women who seemed to thrive on the subversive energy of our project. Our lawsuit became our most powerful tool. Faced with the public relations nightmare of our proposed exhibition and the legal threat of a discovery process that would expose his entire fraudulent life, Julian crumbled. His lawyers, in a series of tense negotiations with Maria, agreed to a settlement. He would drop his lawsuit against me. He would provide a written, notarized confession detailing the existence of his inheritance and his quote-unquote artistic methods. And in the most stunning concession of all, he would release the ruined canvases to my possession. But the journals were a sticking point. He refused to hand them over, claiming they were quote-unquote private intellectual property. He was willing to admit to the financial lie, but he would not give me the very words that documented his emotional vampirism. He would give me the skeleton of his deceit, but he was determined to keep its soul. It was a devastating blow. Without the journals, the exhibition would be weaker, just my word against the backdrop of his ruined art. That's when I remembered. In the chaos of our final confrontation in the flooded studio, I had seen more than just canvases and paint. I had seen his notebooks, the small spiral-bound books he was constantly sketching and writing in. They weren't the leather-bound journals, but they were his constant companions. He took them everywhere, documenting ideas, observations, sketches. He was an obsessive archivist of his own creative process. I called Maria. "The notebooks," I said, my voice trembling with a sudden, dawning hope. He kept dozens of them in the studio, small ones. They have to be filled with his notes, his observations of me. Maria added it to our list of demands. His lawyers fought it, but the threat of the ongoing lawsuit was too great. A week later, a single large box arrived at the gallery. It contained 32 of Julian's notebooks, spanning the entire 8 years of our marriage. Opening that box was one of the hardest things I have ever had to do. Sitting with Eleanor in her clean, white office, I paged through the intimate, terrifying record of my own life, as seen through the eyes of my captor. He had documented everything. There were charcoal sketches of me sleeping, my face etched with exhaustion, with detached analytical notes in the margins. Observe the tension in the jaw, the slight furrow of the brow. This is the texture of authentic weariness. There were pages where he'd transcribed things I'd said in moments of despair, my words of pain treated like snippets of found poetry. He had recorded my weight loss during a particularly difficult winter, my moments of quiet tears, my hollow-eyed silences. It was a brutal, invasive, and profoundly dehumanizing experience to see my life so coldly dissected. But it was also, as Eleanor had predicted, the most powerful evidence we could have asked for. It was the voice of the artist himself, condemning his own work, revealing the parasitic nature of his process. We had our story. We had our art, the haunting, violated canvases, and now we had our text. The gallery's press machine roared to life. A single explosive article was released in a major art magazine telling the story. The Muse's Rebuke, how Sarah Hayes unmasked the art world's most audacious lie. The story went viral. The art world, always hungry for a scandal, a new narrative, devoured it. Julian, who had craved fame and recognition his entire life, was suddenly infamous. He became a pariah overnight, a symbol of artistic fraud and bourgeois exploitation. He retreated, disappearing from public view, his career not just stalled, but utterly annihilated. Meanwhile, I was preparing for my debut. The night before the exhibition opened, I stood alone in the main gallery. The space was silent, reverent. On the stark white walls hung the ruined canvases, my beautiful, violent acts of erasure. On pedestals, encased in glass, were the open notebooks. His cold, spidery handwriting a testament to his crime. Projected on one large wall in a slow, looping video were quotes from my own testimony, my words finally given weight and context. It was a cathedral of not suffering, but of truth. It was the most honest, brutal, and beautiful thing I had ever seen. I hadn't just destroyed his art, I had inadvertently created something new, something real, something of my own. I had taken the ugliest, most painful experience of my life, and I had, against all odds, turned it into art. The opening night of the exhibition was an out-of-body experience. The gallery, a space I would have been cleaning a few months prior, was packed with the city's cultural elite, critics, and the quietly, morbidly curious. They were all there to see the spectacle, to witness the public autopsy of a lie. I stood in a quiet corner with Eleanor, watching people move through the space.
I saw them lean in to read the chilling analytical notes in Julian's journals. I saw them stand before the violated canvases, their expressions a mixture of horror and fascination. I saw them watch the projected words of my testimony, my story finally being told, and I saw it land. I was terrified they would see me as a victim, a pathetic, tragic figure to be pitied. But that's not what happened. As people recognized me, they didn't approach me with pity, but with a strange, powerful kind of respect. An old, formidable-looking woman with a shock of white hair gripped my arm and said, "Good for you. You gave that bastard what he deserved." A young art student, tears in her eyes, told me the exhibition was the most honest thing she had ever seen. They weren't just seeing my pain, they were seeing my rebellion. The art wasn't in the suffering, it was in the act of fighting back. The destruction of the canvases, once a moment of pure, blind rage, had been transformed. It was no longer just an act of vandalism. It was an artistic statement. The Muse's Rebuke was not just the title of the show, it was a manifesto. The exhibition was a staggering success. It became the most talked about show of the year. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Was it art? Was it therapy? Was it a legal deposition? They called it a brutal, necessary, and groundbreaking interrogation of authorship and exploitation. They called me an accidental artist who had created a masterpiece by destroying one. The financial success was just as bewildering. Collectors, drawn to the raw power of the story, wanted to buy the ruined canvases. An anonymous benefactor purchased the entire collection, the canvases, the journals, the rights to the story, for a sum of money that was so large it felt like a number from a different reality. The money, when it appeared in the bank account Maria had set up for me, was more than Julian had inherited. The irony was so profound, so perfect, it was almost comical. My suffering had finally been monetized, but this time, I was the one who held the profits. I never saw Julian again. He vanished, erased from the art world as thoroughly as I had erased his paintings. His name became a cautionary tale, a synonym for inauthenticity. He had craved a legacy, and in the end, he got one. He was a footnote in my story. My life is quiet now, but it's a different kind of quiet. It's not the silence Julian was so afraid of, the silence of an empty, meaningless life. It's a peaceful quiet, a silence of my own choosing. I bought a small house in a town by the sea. I don't work 2 jobs. I don't have to. I spend my days walking on the beach, reading and learning who Sarah Hayes is when she is not a prop in someone else's story. I don't paint. I have no desire to. My single, destructive, creative act was all I had in me, and it was enough. I took the ugliest thing that ever happened to me, and I held it up to the light for the whole world to see. I didn't just reclaim my life, I curated it. I framed it, and I sold it. And it leaves me with a question that I think about on my long walks by the ocean. A question about the strange alchemical nature of art and pain. My ex-husband believed that an artist had the right to use another person's suffering to create something beautiful. My exhibition used my own suffering to create something true. So I have to ask you, does the value of art ever justify the pain it takes to create it?
Don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new stories every day.